Hey, I'm Eggy, and I grew up in the South, and that means my curriculum, like lots of my peers, was pretty biased. But I took this class, and I learned a lot. I learned about my own biases and the biases around me. And so I'm interested. What do these biases look like in the real world? Do my peers think the same way that I thought? Well, I'm here to find out. So now I'm gonna interview a couple of my friends, a couple strangers, and see what they're thinking. Enjoy. What's your name?
Liz.
So when you think of a Southern woman, what do you imagine?
I usually think of a white woman, probably blonde, and like she goes to church, you know?
White woman, blonde hair, typically like well dressed.
I'm a woman with a cowboy hat on doing or dance like square dancing. The first person that came to mind was like Tiana from Princess and the Frog, like a working black woman, I suppose.
Great answers. However, that doesn't include class and it doesn't include racial diversity. Okay, and so when you picture a slaveholder, what comes to mind first?
That same person, her husband.
Wealthy white men at a farm or a big house.
Thinking of a statue because there's a lot of statues of slaveholders. Probably some white guy with a lot of money.
A white man, probably coming from Europe, wealthy.
Yeah, before this class, I would have said the same thing. However, white women were also active slaveholders who bought, sold, and profited from enslaved people. When you think about who benefited from slavery, who do you imagine first?
The wealthy white people.
Anyone who wasn't worried about being in a role of being a slave and basically like psychology, sociology, in group and out group. Anyone who doesn't have to worry about that are the ones who benefited. But more specifically, the ones who had slaves. So like wealthy white men.
Definitely white people and wealthy people.
Slaveholders.
Yeah, we tend to think of white men, but white women also benefited both economically and socially from slavery as well. Okay, so when you think of enslaved women resistance and then they get caught, who do you imagine enforcing that discipline?
Well, I imagine they have a very like early version of the police system. White people, maybe poor white people, but you know, assigned to this job by slave owners or people who wanted to keep slaves.
Same thing, like anyone who isn't in that in or out group, specifically the group of those who are enslaved, I feel like are the ones who want to enforce that discipline. So it's not like, oh, I don't want to be in their position kind of thing. But then again, what comes to mind is wealthy white men.
Probably a white guy with power and weapons and money.
Also be the slaveholders.
You know, white women also enforce that discipline. They often oversaw the labor and movement, especially when it came to being, a mistress. Instead of blaming their slaveholding husbands, they often punished the enslaved women themselves. When you think of early America and early American laws, and you think about the people who influenced that, what do you think of? Or who do you think of?
I think of founding fathers and the early colonies, especially the divide between the North and the South.
The powdered white hair, well dressed at a bar, not drinking a lot of water, mostly like on booze. I think some had good intentions, but good intentions in kind of protecting their own group of white people.
people from Europe who wanted freedom for their people, but also probably had very little empathy considering the fact that they were colonizing a land that was already inhabited.
I guess the founding fathers, so young, powerful white men.
I also picture our founding fathers with powdered wigs, but that doesn't include all the women who, you know, rallied for organizations and got money donated. When you picture a woman living in that early society, what do you picture? What do you think her roles look like?
I imagine she spends a majority of her time at home, uh, cooking, cleaning, kind of taking care of the house. Definitely not working.
Caretaking roles, taking care of the children, cleaning up the house, making the food, making sure that their husband is satisfied.
Like mother and caretaker, like cooking food, washing clothes, farming.
Caretaker, homemaker.
Yeah, so true. I think that's really good points. That was a common woman role during this time, but they also helped enforce racial and labor hierarchies, not to mention sometimes taking on midwifery roles. So during the early 1800s, there was sex work. And so when you picture that kind of sex work, what assumptions do you have?
I assume these are women who are very desperate.
Hmm.
They've probably been outcasted from society also. And I would think they have a very close community with one another.
Sex work today comes from like empowerment or wanting to feel confident in your body and kind of making that your choice, whereas I feel like back then it wasn't so much of that and it was more so forced.
People who did that were probably forced to, because they couldn't make ends meet and make money in other ways. I guess in theory, like you could have made the decision to do it independently, but if you had the freedom to make the decision to work, you probably like be a farmer or something like that. You probably would have preferred to choose that.
Mostly straight people in that maybe sex was only valuable if it were between two white people.
There was widespread prostitution, and I think, yeah, a lot of it came from desperation, but also it was the only means for some of these women to make money. Most surprisingly, there wasn't really sisterhood among these women. It was more so competition. And even if they were actually blood related, there was still no sisterhood. Who do you picture when you think about people supporting the Confederacy on the home front?
I'm thinking of like the most hillbilly, redneck, probably poor white Southern Americans. I would say mostly men. I feel like at this time, I'm not sure a whole lot of women had access to education.
Mhm.
So I think their opinions were very influenced by the men around them.
People from the South with guns.
White men with guns.
The Southerners.
I also think of rednecks, but the reality is there was also white women who maintained farms, resisted Union troops, and upheld that ideology while the men were away. Or there were camp followers, and were right there with them on the home front as, you know, they did the laundry or they provided sex work for the troops. When you think about the Civil War and how it's remembered, how are white women usually portrayed in your mind?
I think the way I was taught, they were never even mentioned really. Behind the scenes of everything. You know, they probably did a lot of caretaking, but not really given any credit.
Like I haven't heard much of women being portrayed during the Civil War. I would imagine it would be like protect your land, protect your rights, protect your family, and doing so, like wanting to keep the nuclear family. But I don't know.
I don't think they ever really have talked about white women when I've learned about that.
I think they mostly, in my mind, they stayed home and took care of the family.
Yeah, we weren't really taught this, and so I think that reaction is pretty valid. But the reality is, even though they were kind of portrayed as irrelevant or victims, they had active support for slavery and for the Confederacy, and I think it's really important that we as a society are taught that. So, what does this all mean? We all have these preset ideologies that aren't really true. So, should we have a federal curriculum for students? I mean, what are the dangers of that? What if that federal curriculum doesn't include these important topics? So, what are lawmakers to do? I think it starts within the home. I think it's important that we educate our youth and that we be mindful of our positions, especially as a white woman. I think it's important that I know my history and what my roles as a white woman would have been during this time, and understanding that from a place of privilege and being able to move within my current society with that knowledge. Thank you for this class. I've really learned a lot, and thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Bye!